I can remember sitting right here in this office, thinking about the consequences of what had taken place. And I didn't need any legal briefs. I didn't need any consultations. I knew we were at war.
On Air Force One, the president told us a story he has never told before on television, his story of the week we went to war.
USA! USA! There was a lot of bloodlust. People were pointing their big old hands at me saying, "Don't you ever forget this, Mr. President. Don't let us down."
We asked the president about his controversial flight across the country in the first hours after the attack.
Air Force One got 2 F-16s at about your 10 o'clock position.
And with extraordinary access to Air Force One, we found there is more to that story than the public ever knew.
The military operator came back to me and in a voice that to me sounded very shaken said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, we can't reach Air Force One."
In pictures, many never seen before, we get a sense of what it was like behind the scenes while Washington was under attack. And those closest to Mr. Bush remember the moments that changed the nation.
As we watched the buildings fall, you know, it was just an unbelievable sight.
In the first few hours, I think the thing that was on everybody's mind was how many more planes are coming.
The president told us about how he decided to gamble on a new kind of war, and about his heartbreak, even now, for those who were lost.
I still get emotional thinking about it because it was a tough time. You know, and it was a tough time for all of us because we were very emotional, and I was emotional at times. I felt the same now as I did then, which was sad.
At the White House, we asked the president whether Americans are safe at home and about the hunt for Osama bin Laden.
After a year, we still don't have Osama bin Laden.
How do you know that?
I'm Dan Rather.
I'm Bob Simon.
I'm Charlie Rose.
I'm Vicki Mabry.
I'm Scott Pelley. The President's Story, tonight on 60 Minutes 2. No president since Abraham Lincoln has seen such horrific loss of life in a war on American soil. No president since James Madison, nearly 200 years ago, has seen the nation's capital city successfully attacked. But 1 year ago, President George W. Bush was thrown into the first great crisis of the 21st century. Tonight, we have the President's Story of the week we went to war. We met with Mr. Bush on 2 occasions, on Air Force One and in the Oval Office. We learned a lot we never knew. And we found that even after a year, the President is still moved, sometimes to tears, when he remembers September 11th.
I knew the farther we got away from September 11th, the more likely it is some around the world would forget the mission, but not me. Not me. I made the pledge to myself and to people that I'm not going to forget what happened on September the 11th. So long as I'm the president, we will pursue the killers and bring them to justice. We owe that to those who've lost their lives.
The memories come back sharp and clear on Air Force One. We joined the president on board the plane on a recent trip cross-country. We wanted to talk to him here because this is where he spent the first hours after the attack.
You know, Mr. President, it occurred to me that not since Lyndon Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One has the airplane been so central to America in a crisis.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but it was certainly a focal point, and it was a place where decisions were being made and doctrine was being said.
It was a flight into war after a day that had started with the usual routine.
Just warming up. Come on, Stretch. Come on. Come on, Stretch.
Before dawn, September 11th, the president was on his routine run. It was just before 6 a.m., and at the same moment, another man was on the move. Mohammed Atta was caught by a security camera on his way to lead the attack on America. 2 hours later, as Mr. Bush drove to an elementary school, hijackers on 4 planes were murdering the flight crews and turning the airliners east. As the motorcade pulled up at 8:45, jet engines echoed in Manhattan. Atta plunged the 767 jumbo jet into World Trade Center Tower 1.
We have something that has
has happened here at the World Trade Center. My heavens, this has just happened within several minutes.
I thought it was an accident. I thought it was a pilot error. I thought that some foolish soul had gotten lost and made a terrible mistake.
Jamie.
Mr. Bush was told about the first plane just before sitting down with a class of second graders. He was watching a reading drill as horror unfolded above Manhattan. Just after 9, United Flight 175 exploded into the second tower.
Oh my God, another plane has just hit another building. Oh, right into the middle of it.
There was a sudden, horrible realization that what had seemed like a terrible mistake was a coordinated attack on the nation, live on TV. Back in the Florida classroom, Press Secretary Ari Fleischer got the news on his pager. The president's chief of staff, Andy Card, stepped in.
What did you say?
A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack.
But when you said those words and stepped back and you looked in his face, what did you see?
I saw him coming to recognition of what I had said. I think he understood that he was going to have to take command as commander-in-chief, not just as president.
What is going through your mind when that news hits you?
That we're at war, and that somebody has dared attack us, and we're going to do something about it. I was trying to, obviously, at that moment, I realized I was in a unique setting to receive a message that somebody had attacked us. And I was looking at these little children, and all of a sudden we're at war. I can remember noticing the press pool and the press corps beginning to get the calls and seeing the look on their face. And I mean, it became evident that we were, you know, that the world had changed.
Mr. President, are you aware of the reports of the plane crash in New York? And is there anything to talk about later?
Mr. Bush walked into a classroom set up with a secure phone. He called the vice president, pulling the phone cord tight as he spun to see the attack on TV. Then he grabbed a legal pad and quickly wrote his first words to the nation.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. Today we've had a national tragedy.
It was 9:30. As he spoke, Mr. Bush did not know that 2 more hijacked jets were streaking toward Washington. Vice President Dick Cheney was in his office at the White House when a Secret Service agent ran in.
And he said, "Sir, we have to leave immediately." And he grabbed, put a hand on the back of my belt, another hand on my shoulder, and propelled me out the door of my office.
Picked you up?
It doesn't really pick you up. I'm not sure. They must train for it. I'm sure how they do it, but they just sort of levitate you down the hallway. You move very fast. You don't have any choice but to go.
There wasn't a lot of time for chit-chat, you know, with the vice president.
Secret Service Director Brian Stafford was in his command center, ordering the roundup of top officials and the first family.
You felt like you had minutes to work with?
Correct. We knew that there were unidentified planes tracking in our direction.
Mr. Cheney was rushed deep under the White House into a bunker called the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. It was built for war, and this was it. On her way down, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice called Mr. Bush.
It was brief because I was being pushed to get off the phone and get out of the West Wing.
They were hurrying you off the phone with the president.
They were hurrying me off the phone with the president, and I just said, he said, "I'm coming back," and we said, "Mr. President, that may not be wise." I remember stopping briefly to call my family, my aunt and uncle in Alabama, and say, "I'm fine, you have to tell everybody that I'm fine." But then settling into trying to deal with the enormity of that moment. And in the first few hours, I think the thing that was on everybody's mind was how many more planes are coming.
The Capitol was evacuated, and for the first time ever, the Secret Service executed the emergency plan to ensure the presidential line of succession. Agents swept up the 15 officials who stood to become president if the others were killed. They wanted to move Vice President Cheney, fearing that he was in danger even in the bunker. But Mr. Cheney told us that when he heard the other officials were safe, he decided to stay at the White House no matter what.
What you're saying is that when you looked at the line of succession, you counted yourself out. At that point, yes. It's important to emphasize it's not personal. You don't think of it in personal terms. You've got a professional job to do.
Mr. Cheney was joined by Transportation Secretary Norm Mineta, who remembers hearing the FAA counting down the hijacked jets closing in on the Capitol.
Someone came in and said, Mr. Vice President, there's a plane 50 miles out. Then he came in and said, it's now 10 miles out. We don't know where it is exactly, but it's coming in low and fast.
It was American Flight 77. At 9:38, it exploded into the Pentagon, the first successful attack on Washington since the War of 1812. As the Pentagon burned, Mr. Bush's limousine sped toward Air Force One in Florida. At that moment, United Flight 93, the last hijacked plane, was taking dead aim at Washington. At the White House, the staff was in the West Wing cafeteria watching on TV. Press Secretary Jennifer Miller-Wise was in the crowd when the order came to evacuate.
And I no sooner walked outside when someone from Secret Service yelled, you know, women, drop your heels and run, drop your heels and run. And suddenly the gates that never open except for authorized vehicles just opened and the whole White House just flooded out.
In Florida, as Mr. Bush boarded Air Force One, he was overheard telling a Secret Service agent, be sure to get the First Lady and my daughters protected. At 9:57, Air Force One thundered down the runway, blasting smoke and dust in a full-thrust takeoff. Communications Director Dan Bartlett was on board.
It was like a rocket. For a good 10 minutes, the plane was going almost straight up.
At the same moment, 56 minutes after it was hit, World Trade Center Tower 2 began to falter, then cascade in an incomprehensible avalanche of steel, concrete, and human lives.
Someone said to me, look at that. I remember that, look at that. I looked up and I saw I just remember a cloud of dust and smoke and the horror of that moment.
And the feeling in your gut?
That we'd lost a lot of Americans and that eventually we would get these people.
You felt the anger rising in you?
I felt the anger. Of course I felt the anger.
Down in the bunker, Mr. Cheney was trying to figure out how many planes were hijacked. At the time, they feared there could be as many as 11.
As the planes are tracking toward Washington, a discussion begins about whether we should shoot them down. How did that happen?
Well, I discussed it with the president. Are we prepared to order our aircraft to shoot down these airliners that have been hijacked? He said yes.
That was your advice to the president?
It was my advice. It was his decision.
That's a sobering moment to order your own combat aircraft to shoot down your own civilian aircraft. But it was an easy decision to make, given the fact that we had learned that commercial aircraft were being used as a weapon. Say easy decision. I didn't hesitate. Let me put it to you that way. I knew what had to be done.
And the passengers on United Flight 93 also knew what had to be done. They fought for control and sacrificed themselves in a Pennsylvania meadow. The flight was 15 minutes from Washington.
There was that horrible time when we wondered if Flight 93 had indeed been shot down by an American pilot.
On the orders of the president?
Yes.
It is quite possible that those people gave their lives for you.
It's entirely possible. In fact, I think it's probable. Clearly, the terrorists were trying to take out as many symbols of government as they could. The Pentagon, perhaps the Capitol, perhaps the White House. These people saved us not only physically, but they saved us psychologically and symbolically in a very important way, too.
But there would be one more symbol to fall. World Trade Center Tower 1 was weakening. It had stood for an hour and 43 minutes, but at 10:29 a.m., it buckled in a mirror image of the collapse of its twin. The image that went round the world reached the First Lady in a secure location somewhere in Washington.
I was very worried, like everybody in America was, about what was going on in New York. We watched the buildings fall, and, you know, it was just an unbelievable sight.
This was a moment when disaster turned to catastrophe.
Yeah.
What did you think when those buildings were coming down?
I was horrified. I thought, dear God, protect as many citizens as you can. It was a nightmare.
By 10:30, America's largest city was devastated, its military headquarters burning. Air Force One turned west along the Gulf Coast.
I can remember sitting right here in this office, thinking about the consequences of what had taken place and realizing it was a defining moment in the history of the United States. And I didn't need any legal briefs. I didn't need any consultations. I knew we were at war.
On our recent trip aboard Air Force One, the president told us about the hours after the attacks. There's a lot about that flight the public never knew. To help us tell the story, we were given access to the plane, including the rarely seen cockpit and communications deck. Mr. Bush told us the first hours were frustrating. He watched the horrifying pictures, but the TV signal was breaking up. His calls to Mr. Cheney were cutting out. The president says he pounded his desk, shouting, "This is inexcusable. Get me the vice president."
I was trying to clear the fog of war, and there is a fog of war. Information was just flying from all directions.
Chief of Staff Card brought in the reports. There was word that Camp David had been hit. A jet was thought to be targeting Mr. Bush's ranch.
I remember hearing that the State Department might have been hit, or that the White House had a fire in it. So we were hearing lots of different information.
You feared all of that was true?
At the time, I did.
They also feared that Air Force One itself was a target. Vice President Cheney told the president there was a credible threat against the plane. Using the code name for Air Force One, Mr. Bush told an aide, "Angel is next." The threat was passed to presidential pilot Colonel Mark Tillman.
It was serious before that, but now it is no longer is it a time to get the president home. We actually have to consider everything we say, everything we do could be intercepted, and we have to make sure that no one knows what our position is.
Tillman asked for an armed guard at his cockpit door while the Secret Service double-checked the identity of everyone on board. The crew reviewed the emergency evacuation plan, and then came a warning from air traffic control. A suspect airliner was dead ahead.
Coming out of Sarasota, there was one call that said there was an airliner off our nose that they did not have contact with.
Tillman took evasive action, pulling his plane high above normal traffic. They were on course for Washington, but by now no one thought that was a good idea, except the president.
I wanted to come back to Washington, but the circumstances were such that it was just impossible for the Secret Service or the National Security team to clear the way for Air Force One to come back.
So Air Force One set course for an underground command center in Nebraska. Back in Washington, the president's closest advisor, Karen Hughes, heard about the threat to the plane and placed a call to Mr. Bush.
And the military operator came back to me and in a voice that to me sounded very shaken said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, we can't reach Air Force One."
Hughes was out of the White House during the attacks, and when she came back, it was a place she didn't recognize.
They were either military or maybe Secret Service, dressed all in black, holding machine guns as we drove up. And I never expected to see something like that in our nation's capital.
And when you entered the White House?
There was no one in sight. And I knew it was a day that you didn't want to surprise anybody. And so I yelled, "Hello." And two, again, kind of SWAT team members came running through the hall with, again, guns drawn, and then took me to the location where I met the vice president.
Back on Air Force One, Colonel Tillman had a problem. He needed to hide the most visible plane in the world, a 747 longer than the White House itself. He didn't want to use his radio. He knew the hijackers were listening to air traffic control. So he called air traffic control on the telephone.
We actually didn't tell them our destination or what directions we were heading. We basically just talked to them and said, "Okay, fine. We have no clearance at this time. We are just going to fly across the United States."
The controllers passed Air Force One from one sector to another, warning each other to keep the route secret.
Okay, where's he going? Just watch him. Don't question about where he's going. Just work him and watch him. And there's no flight plan in right now. We're not going to put anything in. Okay, sir? Copy that.
Air Force One ordered a fighter escort, and air traffic control radioed back.
Air Force One got 2 F-16s at about your 10 o'clock position.
The staff and the president and us were filed out along the outside hallway of his presidential cabin there and looking out the windows. And the president gives them a signal of salute, and the pilot kind of tips his wing and fades off and backs into formation.
The men in the F-16s were Shane Brotherton and Randy Roberts from the Texas Air National Guard. Their mission was so secret their commander wouldn't tell them where they were going.
He just said, "You'll know when you see it." And that was my first clue. I didn't have any idea what we were doing up until that point.
You knew it when you saw it?
Yes, sir.
All day long, they rode shotgun for the president.
We were trying to keep an 80-mile bubble around Air Force One, and we'd investigate anything that was within 80 miles.
Were you worried about the safety of the people on this aircraft in those moments?
No.
Your own safety?
No, I wasn't worried about it. I looked out the airplane and saw 2 F-16 on each wing. There's going to have to be a pretty good pilot to get us.
We now know that the threat to Air Force One was part of that fog of war, a false alarm, but it had a powerful effect at the time. Many in the public wondered, with the president out of sight, was he still running the government? He hadn't appeared after the attack on Washington. Mr. Bush was clearly worried about it. At one point, he was overheard saying, "The American people want to know where their dang president is." The staff considered an address to the nation by phone, but instead, Mr. Bush ordered Air Force One to land somewhere within 30 minutes so he could appear on TV. At 11:45, they landed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
At Barksdale, they believed the situation in Washington was still unsafe. So they continued to Nebraska, to the command center where Mr. Bush would be secure and have all the communications gear he needed to run the government. Aboard Air Force One, Mr. Bush had a job for Press Secretary Fleischer.
The president asked me to make sure that I took down everything that was said. I think he wanted to make certain that a record existed.
Fleischer's notes capture Mr. Bush's language plain and unguarded. To the vice president, he said, "We're at war, Dick. We're going to find out who did this and kick their ass." Another time, Mr. Bush said, "We're not going to have any slap on the wrist crap this time."
And I can remember telling the Secretary of Defense, I said, "We're going to find out who did this. And then, Mr. Secretary, you and Dick Myers, who we had just named as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, are going to go get him."
By 3 o'clock Eastern, Air Force One touched down at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Mr. Bush and his team were herded into a small brick hut that gave no hint of what they would find below. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, this is what they saw. This is the U.S. Strategic Command Underground Command Center. It was built to transmit a president's order to go to nuclear war. But when Mr. Bush walked in, the battle staff was watching the skies over the United States. Many airplanes had still not landed. After a short briefing, Mr. Bush and Chief of Staff Card were taken to a teleconference center which connected them to the White House, the Pentagon, the FBI, and the CIA. Mr. Bush had a question for his CIA director, George Tenet.
George Tenet was just asked, who do you think did this to us? He said, "Sir, I believe it's Al-Qaeda. We're doing the assessment, but it looks like, it feels like, it smells like Al-Qaeda."
The evidence would build. We talked to FBI Director Robert Mueller about an essential clue that came from one of the hijacked planes before it crashed.
There was a flight attendant, Amy Sweeney, who had the presence of mind to call her office as the plane is hijacked and give them the seat numbers of the hijackers. What did that do for you?
That was the first piece of hard evidence. We could then go to the manifest, find out who was sitting in those seats, and immediately conduct an investigation of those individuals, as opposed to taking all of the passengers on the plane and going through a process of elimination.
In Nebraska, the White House staff was preparing for an address to the nation from the Air Force bunker. But by then, the president had had enough. He decided to come back.
At one point, he said he didn't want a tin-horn terrorist keeping him out of Washington.
Come on, he really said, I don't want a tin-horn terrorist to keep me out of Washington?
That's verbatim.
On board, he was already thinking of issuing an ultimatum to the world.
When was it, Mr. President, that you made this decision to go after not just the terrorists, but those who harbored them?
Right here on Air Force One. I had time to think. And a couple of thoughts emerged. One was that you're guilty if you harbor a terrorist, because I knew these terrorists, like Al-Qaeda, like to prey on weak government, weak people. The other thought that came was the opportunity to fashion a vast coalition of countries that would either be with us or with the terrorists.
Even in those early hours on Air Force One, you were looking out on a world that was suddenly pretty black and white to you.
That's right. I felt that way.
As Air Force One sped east, the last casualty of the attack on America collapsed. World Trade Center number 7, 47 stories in the street. One of the nation's worst days wore into evening. At the World Trade Center, 2,801 were killed. At the Pentagon, 184. And in Pennsylvania, 40. Altogether, there were 3,025 dead.
Anybody who would attack America the way they did, anybody who would take innocent life the way they did, anybody who is so devious is evil.
Mr. Bush would soon see that evil face to face. After arriving in Washington, he boarded his helicopter and flew past the Pentagon on the way to the White House.
Was there a time that you were afraid there would not be a White House to return to?
I don't remember thinking about whether or not the White House would have been obliterated. I think they might have thought they took their best shot, and now it's time for to take our best shot.
Mr. Bush arrived back at the White House 9 hours after the attacks. His next step was to address the nation. Karen Hughes and her staff were already working on the speech.
He decided that the primary tone he wanted to strike that night was reassurance. We had to show resolve. We had to reassure people. We had to let them know that we would be okay.
Just off the Oval Office, Mr. Bush added the words that would become known as the Bush Doctrine. No distinction between terrorists and those who harbor them. The staff wanted to add a declaration of war, but Mr. Bush didn't think the American people wanted to hear it that night. He prepared to speak to the nation from the same desk where Franklin Roosevelt first heard the news of Pearl Harbor. Now he was commander-in-chief. 80 million Americans were watching.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
The Oval Office speech came at the end of the bloodiest day in American history since the Civil War. Mr. Bush walked to the White House residence for the night. An hour later, a Secret Service agent rushed the President and the First Lady down to the White House bunker. They were tracking an unidentified plane. It turned out to be one of ours, now protecting Washington.
60 Minutes 2 continues in a moment with Day 2 of the President's Story.
Good evening. I'm Laura Diaz.
I'm Harold Greene. Along with the CBS television network, CBS 2 News has been covering the many events that are happening right here in the Southland to commemorate the anniversary of September 11th.
At this hour, hundreds of people are taking part in a vigil in West Hollywood. The memorial began just after sunset around 7:30 p.m. in the area around Santa Monica Boulevard between La Brea and Doheny, and on Sunset from Crescent Heights to Doheny Drive. There is still time to go down there. Organizers are asking that you bring candles, signs, and any tributes you might want to share.
As this day of remembering faded into memory, there was one final ceremony here on the edge of the Pacific Ocean as the sun set peacefully. A procession that began in the valley early this morning ended in San Pedro. It was at the Korean Friendship Bell in Angels Gate Park. To close the ceremony, the giant bell rang 4 times, twice for New York, once for the Pentagon, once for those passengers who died trying to save the lives of others in Pennsylvania.
Tributes to 9/11 started at dawn with a rolling procession through Los Angeles, beginning with a somber vigil in North Hollywood.
Was blind, but now.
Dozens of people gathered to honor those lost with songs and prayers at the LA Remembers observance. Mayor James Hahn, along with fire and police department officials, was also on hand. The procession also stopped at the Station 88 in Sherman Oaks, where firefighters honored fallen colleagues and thanked the public for unflagging support.
Well, we now take a look at what we have coming up on CBS 2 News at 11 for you.
And you were seeing an exclusive interview tonight on CBS with President Bush. At 11, we'll break down what he has to say about Iraq heading into tomorrow's speech.
Plus, former President Bill Clinton makes a 9/11 anniversary appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman. We'll have a preview and a look at all of today's ceremonies tonight on CBS 2 News at 11.
By the day after September 11th, President Bush was demanding a war plan. No one in the White House or the Pentagon could be sure of what the president would do. He'd been president for only 8 months, and he'd never been tested as commander-in-chief.
You were new to the Pentagon. Do you think your generals at that point had any concern about the kind of strike you would order?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know. I think they're all probably taking a step back and saying, is this guy going to lead us? I never asked them what they thought because I knew what I was going to do. I knew exactly what had to be done, Scott. And that was to set a strategy to seek justice, find out who did it, hunt them down, and bring them to justice.
September 12th, in the cabinet room, the president made clear what was next.
The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war.
To the War Cabinet, al-Qaeda was no surprise. National Security Advisor Rice says the administration had been at work on a plan to strike bin Laden's organization well before September 11th.
The president said, you know, I'm tired of swatting at flies. I need a strategy to eliminate these guys.
But in one of the worst intelligence failures ever, the CIA and FBI didn't pick up clues that an attack in the United States was imminent. Without a sense of urgency, the White House strategy the president had asked for came too late.
I understand that that plan was moving along and was just about ready for presentation to the president. The president must
literally
have
headed to the president's desk, I think, on the 10th or 11th of September.
Now the War Cabinet was debating the full range of options, who to hit and how to hit them.
Well, there were some at the Pentagon who worried in the early hours that you would order up an immediate cruise missile strike of the kind that never deterred bin Laden in the past.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, there's a lot of nervous Nellies at the Pentagon anyway. There's a lot of people like to chatter, you know, more than they should. But no, I appreciate that very much. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld early on discussed the idea of making sure we have what's called boots on the ground. That if you're going to go to war, that you got to go to war with all your assets.
What concerns did you have in the early going about the kinds of ideas that were being presented?
My biggest concern was that we fight and win a guerrilla war with conventional means.
It was an innovative but risky idea being proposed by CIA Director George Tenet. Tenet wanted to combine American technology and intelligence with the brute force of Afghan fighters hostile to the Taliban government. Secretary of State Colin Powell says the CIA had already developed a long relationship with the Afghan resistance.
The plan was unconventional, even in the early stage of developing it.
It was unconventional because it was an unconventional situation. As I like to describe it to my friends, we had on the ground a fourth world army riding horses and living in tents with some CIA and special forces with them. And we had a first world Air Force, the best in the world. How do you connect it all?
That's what the president wanted to know. He gave them 48 hours to figure it out.
Appreciate it. At least I should.
Later that afternoon, Mr. Bush went to the battlefield himself. Just the day before, he had called the Pentagon the mightiest building in the world. Now, 1/5 of it was in ruins. The wreckage of American Flight 77 was being examined by Navy investigators. And before Mr. Bush left, he made a point of speaking personally with the team recovering the remains of the first casualties of war on his watch. The next day, September 13th, Mr. Bush was driving back to the White House when there was another warning of attack that the public never heard about. Threats were coming in constantly, but this one sounded credible. A large truck bomb headed to the White House. The Secret Service wanted the president back in the bunker.
The director of the Secret Service, Brian Stafford, was standing in the doorway of the Oval Office. And he basically said, Mr. President, you need to leave. There's been another threat against the White House.
He wasn't real receptive to that recommendation. And he ordered a hamburger and said he was going to stay in the White House that evening, and that's what he did.
That was Thursday night. The next day would be one of the longest and the most difficult for the president. Friday, September 14th. Mr. Bush started the day with a cabinet meeting, but he teared up when he walked in and was surprised by applause.
He sat down and slightly overcome for a moment, but then he recaptured it.
But the Secretary of State was worried that Mr. Bush might have trouble getting through his speech at the National Memorial Service later that morning.
And I just scribbled a little note to him, and I said, Mr. President, I've learned over the years that when you're going to give a very emotional speech, watch out for certain words that will cause you to, start to tear up. And he looked at me and he smiled. And then at the next break in the conversation, he says, Secretary of State just told me not to break down at the memorial service. And that broke the tension. Everybody started laughing. I felt embarrassed.
You were involved in planning the memorial service after September 11th. What did you feel that service needed to achieve for the country?
I wanted it to be dignified. I wanted the Psalms and everything that was read to be comforting, because I think we were a country that needed, every one of us needed comforting.
We are here in the middle hour of our grief. So many have suffered so great a loss, and today we express our nation's sorrow. This nation is peaceful, but fierce when stirred to anger.
As we stood to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, you could feel the entire congregation, and I could certainly feel myself, stiffen, the kind of spine. And this deep sadness was being replaced by resolve. We all felt that we still had mourning to do for our countrymen who had been lost, but that we also had a new purpose in not just avenging what had happened to them, but making certain that the world was eventually going to be safe from this kind of attack ever again.
Next came Ground Zero.
You had been briefed on Ground Zero. Were you prepared for what you saw when you walked up there?
No, you couldn't brief me. You couldn't brief anybody on Ground Zero till you saw it. It was ghostly. It was like you're having a bad dream. And you're walking through the dream. There was tears, there was anger. These men and women reflected the mood of the country. And there they started to chant USA. USA! USA! And there was a lot of bloodlust. People were, pointing their big old hands at me saying, don't you ever forget this, Mr. President. Don't let us down. The scene was very powerful, very powerful.
Mr. Bush tried to speak, but they kept shouting, "We can't hear you."
I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Mr. Bush had been in New York just a few weeks before. He'd posed with the firemen who always stood by when the president's helicopter landed there. Now, 5 of the men who stood with the president in the picture were dead, lost at Ground Zero. When the president arrived, Manhattan was papered with the faces of the lost. Families held on to the hope that their loved ones were missing, unable to believe that so many had vanished in an instant. It was a place where a child comforted a grieving mother. These were the families Mr. Bush would meet next, several hundred in a convention hall, a meeting that the public never saw.
People said to me, he'll come out, don't worry, Mr. President. We'll see him soon. I know my loved one. He'll find a place to survive underneath the rubble, and we'll get him out. I, on the other hand, had been briefed about the realities, and my job was to hug and to cry. But I remember the whole time thinking, this is incredibly sad because the loved ones won't come out.
I'm told a story, Mr. President, of a little boy who handed you a picture of his father in his firefighter uniform.
Right.
And you signed it and handed it back, and he burst into tears. Do you remember that young man?
I do. I remember a lot of young boys. When they started to get me to sign the picture, I said, your daddy won't believe that I was here, so you show him that autograph. Just trying to provide a little hope.
It's a difficult time to be with those.
It was tough, you know. It was. I still get emotional thinking about it because we're dealing with people who loved their dads or loved their mom, loved their wives who loved their husbands. It was a tough time, you know, and it was a tough time for all of us because we were very emotional, and I was emotional at times. I felt the same now as I did then, which was sad, and I still feel sad for those who grieve for their families. But as I said, out of my tears, I see opportunity.
The president was supposed to be with the families for about 30 minutes. He stayed for 2.5 hours. It was here that he met Arlene Howard. Her son George was among the first to be found at Ground Zero.
I called the police department and they said he hadn't called in for roll call and to call back in an hour. And I said, no, I don't need to call back. If he hadn't called in, I knew where he was.
You knew where he was.
I figured he was up in heaven by then.
George Howard had once rescued children at the World Trade Center when it was bombed in 1993. He had been off duty that day, and he was off duty on September 11th, but he couldn't stay away. The police department gave his badge to his mother, and she gave it to the president.
He leaned over to talk to me and extend his sympathy to me, and that's when I asked him, I'd like to present George's shield to him in honor of all the men and women that were killed over there.
By the end of that day, Mr. Bush flew to Camp David, visibly drained.
He was physically exhausted. He was mentally exhausted. He was emotionally exhausted. He was spiritually exhausted.
The next day, Saturday, September 15th, he gathered the members of his war cabinet at the presidential retreat for a last, decisive meeting.
And from them you want what, sir?
I want victory. I want a war plan. My message is for everybody who wears the uniform, get ready. The United States will do what it takes.
He was encouraging us to think boldly. He was listening to all ideas. He was not constrained to any one idea. He wanted to hear his advisors talk and argue and debate with each other.
Scott, we've never fought a war like this. This is a different kind of war. It's unique. a coalition was coming together. The Secretary of Defense put into place a full-scale military operation to hold the Taliban accountable. The CIA intelligence gathering was honing in. And so there was progress made. I was pleased with the progress. On the other hand, I wanted to start clarifying plans. And I went around the room and asked everybody what they thought ought to happen.
When you left that meeting on Saturday night, you didn't tell them what you wanted to do.
No, I didn't. I wanted to just think it through. This was, anytime you commit our troops to harm's way, there's a president must make sure that he fully understands all the consequences and ramifications. And I wanted to just spend some time on it alone, and did.
And your last reservations that you had to clear up in your own mind were what?
Could we win? I don't want to be putting our troops in there unless I'm certain we could win. And I was certain we could win.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
9 days after the attack on America, before a joint session of Congress, the President committed the nation to the war on terror.
Each of us will remember what happened that day and to whom it happened. We'll remember the moment the news came, where we were and what we were doing. Some will remember an image of a fire or a story of rescue. Some will carry memories of a face and a voice gone forever. And I will carry this. It is the police shield of a man named George Howard, who died at the World Trade Center trying to save others. It was given to me by his mom, Arlene, as a proud memorial to her son. It is my reminder of lives that ended and a task that does not end.
A year has passed since that September. At the White House recently, the President told us his job now is to remind Americans that the nation is still at war. A war he reminds himself of every day in the Oval Office, literally keeping score, one terrorist at a time.
I'm told that right in your desk you actually keep a scorecard.
Actually, I have a classified document that might have some pictures on there, just to keep reminding me about who's out there, where they might be.
And you check them off as they go?
Well, I might put a little check on her, yeah.
But there's no check by the name that must be on the top of that list. When we come back, Mr. Bush talks about the hunt for Osama bin Laden.
You can log on to CBSNews.com to see a video timeline of the president's story.
Good evening, I'm Harold Greene.
And I'm Laura Diaz. Along with CBS Network, CBS 2 News has been covering the many events that are happening right here in the Southland. All this to commemorate the anniversary of September 11th.
At this hour, hundreds of people are taking part in a vigil in West Hollywood. The memorial began just after sunset, around 7:30, in the area around Santa Monica Boulevard between La Brea and Doheny, and on Sunset from Crescent Heights to Doheny Drive. There's still time to go down there, so organizers are asking you that you bring some candles, signs, and any tributes that you might want to share.
As this day of remembering faded into memory, there was one final ceremony here on the edge of the Pacific Ocean as the sun set peacefully. A procession that began in the valley early this morning ended in San Pedro. It was at the Korean Friendship Bell in Angels Gate Park. To close the ceremony, the giant bell rang 4 times. Twice for New York, once for the Pentagon, once for those passengers who died trying to save the lives of others in Pennsylvania.
Remembering the lives of those lost a year ago today took all forms, including an aerial salute across the city. A plane towing 5 large American flags and a banner saying "United We Stand" flew over the San Fernando Valley early this morning.
And now a look at what we have coming up on CBS 2 News at 11.
You're seeing an exclusive interview tonight on CBS with President Bush at 11. We'll break down what he has to say about Iraq heading into tomorrow's speech.
Plus, former President Bill Clinton makes a 9/11 anniversary appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman.
And we'll have a preview and a look at all of today's ceremonies throughout Southern California as well as around the country tonight on CBS 2 News at 11. We thank you for watching, and we hope you'll join us at 11.
A lot has happened in the years since September 11th, everything from this week's heightened terror alert to all the talk about going to war with Iraq. Last week in the Oval Office, we asked the president about what's coming next in the war on terror. You must be frustrated, maybe angry. After a year, we still don't have Osama bin Laden.
How do you know that? Look, I don't know whether Osama bin Laden is dead or alive. I don't know that. He's not leading a lot of parades. And he's not nearly the hero that a lot of people thought he was. This is much bigger than one person anyway. This is, we're slowly but surely dismantling and disrupting an al-Qaeda network that hates America. And we will stay on task until we complete the task. I always knew this was a different kind of war, Scott. See, in the old days, you could measure the size and strength of the enemy by counting his tanks or his airplanes and his ships. This is an international manhunt. We're after these people one at a time. They're killers, period.
But have you won the war before you find Osama bin Laden dead or alive?
If he were dead, there's somebody else to replace him. And we would find that person. But slowly but surely, we will dismantle the al-Qaeda network and those who sponsor them and those who harbor them, and at the same time, hopefully lay the seeds for the conditions necessary so that people don't feel like they've got to conduct terror to achieve objectives.
Do you look back on the Afghan campaign with any doubts? Certainly, we've overthrown the Taliban government. Certainly, al-Qaeda has been scattered. But some of the Taliban leaders appear to have gotten away, and there have been many civilian casualties there as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I worry, I'm sad that civilians lost their life, but I understand war. We did everything we could to protect people. When civilians did die, it was because of mistake, certainly not because of intention. We liberated a country, for which I'm extremely proud. No, I don't second guess things. Things never go perfect in a time of war.
Are you committed to ending the rule of Saddam Hussein?
I'm committed to a regime change.
There are those who have been vocal in their advice against war in Iraq. Some of our allies in the Gulf War, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, for example. Even your father's former national security advisor, Mr. Scowcroft, has written about it in the paper. What is it, in your estimation, that they don't understand about the Iraq question that you do appreciate?
The policy of the government's regime change, Scott, hadn't changed. I get all kinds of advice. I'm listening to the advice. I appreciate the consultations. And we'll consult with a lot of people, but our policy hasn't changed.
On Air Force One, you described the terrorists as evil.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But at the same time, many in the Arab world are angry at the United States for political reasons, because of our policy in Israel or our troops in the oil region of the Middle East. Is there any change in foreign policy that you're considering that might reduce Arab anger against the United States?
Well, I'm working for peace in the Middle East. I'm the first president who ever went to the United Nations and publicly declared the need to have a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel in peace. I made it clear that in order for there to be peace, the Palestinians have got to get some leadership that renounces terror and believes in peace and quits using the Palestinian people as pawns. I've also made it very clear to the other Arab nations in the region that they've got responsibilities. If you want peace, they got to work toward it. We're more than willing to work toward it, but they got to work toward it as well. But all this business isn't going to happen as long as a few are willing to blow up the hopes of many. And so we all got to work to fight off terror.
Arafat has to go?
He's been a complete failure as far as I'm concerned, utter disappointment.
There has been some concern over the year about civil liberties.
Yeah.
In fact, an appeals court recently was harsh about your administration's decision to close certain deportation hearings. They said, quote, a government operating in secrecy stands in opposition to the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you draw the line, sir?
I draw the line at the Constitution. We will protect America, but we will do so within the guidelines of the Constitution, the confines of the Constitution, the spirit of the Constitution.
Has there been anything that the Justice Department has brought to you as an idea that you thought, no, that's too far, I don't want to go?
Not that I remember, and I'm pleased with the Justice Department. I think the Attorney General is doing a fine job, by the way. You know, to the extent that our courts are willing to make sure that they review decisions we make, I think that's fine. I mean, that's good. That's healthy. That's part of America.
Franklin Roosevelt said that America should stand in defense of 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have that today, Mr. President? Freedom from fear?
I think more than we did in retrospect. The fact that we're on alert, the fact that we understand the new circumstances makes us more free from fear than on that fateful day of September the 11th. But we've got more work to do.
And Americans should not live their lives in fear.
I don't think so, no. I think Americans ought to know their government's doing everything possible to help. And obviously, if we get information that relates directly to a particular attack, we'll deal with it. And if we get general background noise about a potential attack, we'll alert people. But there are a lot of good folks working hard to disrupt and deny and run down leads. And the American people need to go about their lives. And it seems like they are.
1 year ago, the president was new on the job with little foreign policy experience. He had wanted to pull the military back from foreign entanglements. Now, on his orders, U.S. forces are engaged around the globe in a war he did not expect, in a world completely changed. I'm Scott Pelley. We'll be back 2 weeks from tonight with another edition of 60 Minutes 2. Still ahead tonight, inside Ground Zero with the firemen and the filmmakers who lived to tell the story.